Have you ever wondered how something as simple as a helmet could change the course of an entire battle? Imagine a scenario where military leaders scoffed at the very idea of a new piece of equipment until it turned out to be the key to saving thousands of lives in just 1 week. The concept seems almost too good to be true, doesn't it? But that's exactly what happened when soldiers laughed at the first sight of the newly designed helmet, never dreaming it would soon become their lifeline. This helmet, which many initially dismissed as impractical, was seen as a laughable attempt at innovation. It was too bulky, too odd-looking, and the material seemed unfit for the harsh realities of combat. Senior officers mocked it. They were used to traditional designs that had been in place for years. Helmets that protected against shrapnel butts weren't built for modern warfare's rapidly changing tactics. This new design, with its strange contours and added bulk, seemed unnecessary, an overcomplication to something so essential and simple. But when the battlefront shifted to a region where every single soldier's life seemed to hang by a thread, that helmet became the one thing standing between them and certain death. The soldiers who wore it during an intense week-long engagement experienced something that no one could have anticipated. While the enemy unleashed a ferocious barrage, it wasn't the conventional weaponry that led to victory. It was the helmet, which with blasts absorbed impact and shielded vital areas like never before. The tide of the battle shifted when the helmet's true value was realized. On the front lines, soldiers were no longer risking their lives without the right protection. Those who once mocked the innovation had no choice but to acknowledge its superiority as casualties dropped drastically. The helmets, which had once been the subject of ridicule, were now the unsung heroes of the conflict. The outcome of this engagement was a turning point not only in the battle, but in military strategy. What was seen as unnecessary technology had proved itself vital. The soldiers, once exposed and vulnerable, were now able to hold their ground with confidence, thanks to a piece of equipment no one ever thought would be capable of changing the course of such a critical conflict. It's hard to imagine that something as small as a helmet could hold so much significance. But the truth is, innovations like these don't always make an impact in the way we expect. Sometimes it's the unexpected changes, the ones that seem flawed or impossible, that turn the tide of history. But this was only the beginning. What came next would prove just how much we had underestimated this simple piece of armor. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, take a moment to let us know your thoughts in the comments below. It's crucial for us to understand what you think about this unexpected turn of events. Did you ever think a helmet could save so many lives in such a short time? Drop a comment and share your thoughts. Let's get a conversation going. And don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed this video, and if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll be the first to know when we uncover more forgotten moments in history. Your engagement truly helps us continue bringing these incredible stories to life. So, please leave a comment, like, and subscribe to join us on this journey. Imagine you're in the midst of a brutal battle, the sound of gunfire and explosions filling the air. Your team is outnumbered, your resources are running low, and victory seems impossible. Now, picture an armor that wasn't supposed to work, a design that many thought was too heavy, too clunky, and too impractical for modern warfare. Yet, this very armor became the unexpected game changer, saving countless soldiers and tipping the scales of the conflict. At first, military leaders had no faith in this new armor. It was bulky, heavier than anything they'd seen before, and didn't offer the sleek, lightweight protection they had grown accustomed to. When it was introduced, it was brushed off as an unnecessary experiment. Officers and soldiers alike questioned whether it was even worth the effort. It seemed to go against everything they had learned about battlefield gear. But when the battle raged on and the enemy pressed forward with an unrelenting force, the soldiers who were equipped with this impractical armor found themselves in an unlikely position. The armor, with its extra weight and robust design, absorbed the brunt of explosive shrapnel and bullets, keeping its wearers alive in situations where others would have surely perished. The turning point came during a key confrontation. The enemy launched an all-out attack, and the pressure on the front lines was intense. But those wearing a new armor found that they were able to withstand hits that would have otherwise been fatal. The result? Casualties on the side of the troops wearing the armor were significantly lower. The battlefield shifted from one of despair to one of unexpected hope, all because of a piece of equipment that had been written off as too bulky and cumbersome. This armor didn't just protect soldiers physically, it became a symbol of resilience. In the days that followed, the enemy forces began to falter, realizing that their opponents were no longer as vulnerable as they had been before. The tides of war shifted as this misunderstood piece of military technology showed its true value. And this wasn't just about protection, it was about confidence. The soldiers who had once feared the worst now found themselves able to hold their ground with a new sense of security. They were no longer outgunned. They were equipped with an unexpected advantage. What had once been a symbol of doubt became the very key to their survival. As the battle raged on, the newfound effectiveness of this armor spread throughout the ranks. Soldiers swapped stories of how they'd survived near-death experiences, all thanks to the very thing they had once dismissed. The armor, once seen as a mistake, had transformed into one of the most successful innovations of the war. There's a certain kind of person who defies the odds, who goes beyond the call of duty in ways that seem almost impossible. Now, picture this: a soldier just like any other, equipped with the same standard gear as his comrades. But when the battle reached its most brutal point, when everything seemed lost, it was his decision to wear a new, ridiculed helmet that changed the course of his baton, saved his life when no one else could have survived. This soldier, let's call him Sergeant Thomas, had always been a dedicated warrior, following the orders and the training he had been given. When the new helmet was issued, it was seen as just another piece of military equipment. Nothing special, certainly not. Something worth paying extra attention to. But, as fate would have it, Sergeant Thomas chose to wear it. Not because of any particular belief in its effectiveness, but simply because it was given to him and he didn't want to leave it behind. As the battle grew more intense, his comrades, armed with the standard issue helmets, were falling one by one. The air was filled with the sound of artillery shells bursting, and the ground beneath them shook with the weight of explosions. Sergeant Thomas found himself in the thick of it all, taking cover behind whatever he could find, but the battle was relentless. He watched as soldiers around him were injured, some fatally, by shrapnel and debris from explosions. Then it happened. A sudden, powerful explosion rang out just feet away from Sergeant Thomas. His heart raced as he felt the shock wave slam into his body, sending him tumbling across the ground. But when the dust settled and the chaos subsided, something miraculous occurred. Sergeant Thomas, despite being in the heart of the blast, was alive. When medics rushed to his position, they couldn't believe their eyes. He had no severe injuries, no major wounds, something that had been almost impossible for anyone else caught in such an explosion. It was the helmet that had saved him. The extra material, the padding, and the reinforced design had absorbed the impact, shielding his head and neck from the worst of the blast. The soldiers who had mocked it were now nowhere to be found. Some were wounded, others had died, but Sergeant Thomas stood up, stunned but unharmed. all thanks to a piece of equipment that everyone had once dismissed. This wasn't just about survival, it was about defying the odds. The helmet that was seen as a failure was now the reason a soldier who should have died was alive. The initial mockery turned into admiration, and what had once been the laughingstock of the army was now recognized as the very thing that saved lives. But this story doesn't end there. Sergeant Thomas wasn't the only one to benefit from this overlooked piece of gear. As the battle continued, more and more soldiers realized that this helmet, once deemed bulky or impractical, was now a symbol of safety, protection, and survival. They began wearing it without question, understanding that in a war where everything could change in a heartbeat, the smallest, most unexpected innovations could make all the difference. Imagine being a military leader, someone with years of experience, someone who has seen the rise and fall of countless strategies. Now, picture that same leader, surrounded by his officers, confidently dismissing a new military innovation as nothing more than a passing fad. They had seen it all. Nothing could possibly surprise them anymore. But what they didn't know was that the very thing they dismissed would soon prove to be the catalyst for a breakthrough that would leave them speechless. This breakthrough wasn't a new weapon, a new type of ammunition, or an advanced combat vehicle. No, it was something much simpler, something that, at first glance, seemed unnecessary, even laughable. But when the pressure mounted and the battlefield shifted in unpredictable ways, this innovation, something so seemingly trivial, became the turning point in a battle that no one thought could be won. It all started when the generals, who had been following traditional strategies for years, were presented with a new concept, a piece of equipment that no one had seriously considered before. Some saw it as an impractical addition to the soldiers' already heavy load, while others mocked it outright. They thought it was a waste of resources, an unnecessary complication. But when the situation turned desperate on the battlefield, the generals' traditional methods were no longer enough. The battle had shifted. What had been a controlled, methodical engagement turned into a chaotic and unpredictable nightmare. Enemy forces had adapted faster than anyone had anticipated, and the troops were beginning to lose ground. There was no room for error, and every mistake was costing lives. That's when the soldiers, equipped with this new innovation, were able to hold their ground. In a key moment of the conflict, when everything seemed lost, these soldiers stood firm. The very equipment that had been mocked became the reason they were able to withstand enemy attacks that would have otherwise shattered their line. It wasn't some grand, complex military strategy. It was this small, unassuming innovation that turned the tide. The generals, who had watched in disbelief as their tactics faltered, now saw firsthand the power of this breakthrough. They had been wrong. Their confidence in traditional methods had blinded them to the changing nature of warfare. It wasn't just the soldiers who had adapted, it was the technology they used. And this technology, which they had initially written off as insignificant, was now the reason their forces were able to push forward, regain control, and eventually win the battle. This moment didn't just change the course of that battle, it changed the way these generals would approach warfare from that point forward. They realized that innovation, no matter how small it seemed, could be the key to overcoming even the most daunting challenges. What had once been dismissed as a triviality was now the cornerstone of victory. Sometimes the greatest heroes don't come with medals or applause. In fact, most of the time, the unsung heroes are the ones whose names we never hear, whose actions go unnoticed in the chaos of war. But, as history has shown, it's often the quiet, unassuming individuals who make the difference between disaster and triumph. And in one pivotal moment. A simple change, one that everyone else had overlooked, became the only thing standing between victory and catastrophe. This particular hero wasn't a general or a famous tactician. In fact, he wasn't even someone who held a significant rank. He was a humble mechanic working in the background, unnoticed by the officers commanding the troops. But his contribution would prove to be one of the most critical of the war. The situation was dire. The soldiers on the front lines were outnumbered, outgunned, and on the brink of collapse. The enemy had pushed forward, and everything was falling apart. It seemed like the end was inevitable until this mechanic noticed something that no one else had. A piece of equipment. Something so simple, yet so vital, was malfunctioning. It was a small oversight. Something that everyone had assumed was working perfectly, but it had been the source of many problems that were now escalating. While the officers were busy coordinating defense plans and sending troops into the fray, this mechanic quietly set to work, making a quick but crucial adjustment. No one noticed, no one was watching, but what he did in those moments would change everything. By fixing that small malfunction, he prevented what could have been a catastrophic failure. As the battle continued, the change he made began to show its impact. What had been a liability, a weakness that could have exposed the entire operation, was now a strength. The equipment worked as it was supposed to, and the soldiers were able to carry on, pushing forward in ways they never could have without it. The front line held, and the tide of battle began to turn. This mechanic-esque quiet action, done without fanfare and with no expectation of recognition, was the turning point. His simple fix stopped a chain reaction of failures that would have doomed the mission. It wasn't a grand strategy or a new weapon that saved the day. It was a small, often overlooked change that no one else thought was necessary. In the end, the battle was won. And though the mechanic's name was never spoken aloud in the war reports, those who were there knew exactly who the real hero was. Sometimes the simplest changes have the greatest impact. And sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who don't seek the spotlight. They just do what needs to be done. It's easy to dismiss something when you don't fully understand its value, especially in times of war when every decision feels like life or death. Soldiers and officers alike often view new innovations with skepticism. After all, the tried and tested methods have always worked, haven't they? But what happens when the very thing you laugh at, the thing you dismiss as a foolish idea, turns out to be the one thing that could save your life? And what happens when, instead of embracing change, you stubbornly stick to the old was only to pay the price for your ignorance? When the new helmet design was first introduced, it was mocked relentlessly. To the soldiers, it seemed awkward, cumbersome, and unnecessary. They had worn the same style of helmets for years, and to them, no change was needed. The officers, too, didn't see any real benefit. They viewed the new helmets as just another fodder distraction from the real issues at hand. Why fix what wasn't broken? The old helmets had protected them through countless battles, and no one saw any reason to believe this new design would make any difference. But as the war escalated and the battlefronts became more intense, something unexpected happened. The very helmets that had been ridiculed began to prove their worth. During a brutal engagement, when the enemy launched a fierce assault, the soldiers who were equipped with the new helmets experienced something that their counterparts didn't. Protection, the extra padding, the reinforced design, and the improved fit all combined to absorb impacts and shrapnel, saving countless soldiers from injury and death. Meanwhile, those who had stuck with the older designs found themselves facing devastating consequences. The very helmets they had trusted failed them when they needed protection the most. Shrapnel pierced through leaving soldiers vulnerable to the very forces they had tried to fight. What was once seen as a minor inconvenience, the awkwardness of wearing the new helmet, had become the difference between life and death. The battlefield was no longer a place of predictable outcomes. As casualties rose on one side and fell on the other, the truth was undeniable. The new helmet had saved lives. Those who had mocked it were now left with the harsh reality that their resistance to change had come at a high cost. It wasn't just about a piece of equipment, it was about adaptability, the willingness to embrace innovation, and the ability to recognize when something new could make a difference. The lesson was clear. Innovation, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, could have profound effects on the outcome of a battle. And sometimes, the thing you laugh at today could be the very thing that saves your life tomorrow. It's often said that battles are won not just by the soldiers who fight them, but by the equipment that supports And while weapons and strategies are often the stars of war stories, there's one unsung hero that rarely gets the credit it deserves. The helmet. What if I told you that in one of the most decisive battles of the war, the true MVP wasn't a general, a soldier, or even a weapon? It was the helmet. When the battle began, it seemed like just another engagement, one of many in a brutal and long-lasting war. The soldiers, their weapons at the ready and their minds focused on the task at hand, didn't think much of their headgear. After all, they had been using helmets for years, the same old, reliable designs that had gotten them through countless skirmishes. But this battle would be different. This would be the moment when the helmets, those seemingly ordinary pieces of gear, became the defining factor between survival and death. The enemy forces launched a vicious assault, attacking with everything they had. The first wave was met with fierce resistance. But as the battle progressed, it became clear that the soldiers wearing the newer helmets were able to hold their ground far better than those without. The reason? The helmets weren't just for show. They had been redesigned for maximum protection against modern weapons, reinforced with new materials that could absorb the shock of blasts and deflect shrapnel in ways the older models simply couldn't. As the battle raged on, those wearing the new helmets found themselves shielded from direct hits that would have otherwise been fatal. The soldiers wearing the outdated models, however, were falling at a much higher rate. It wasn't their training, their strategy, or even their weapons that failed them. It was the simple fact that they weren't properly protected. They hadn't adapted to the new realities of warfare. And that's when the shift happened. The soldiers with the newer helmets, those who had been mocked for their unnecessary equipment, began to push back. Their protection allowed them to stay in the fight longer, to weather the storm and continue to battle when others had been knocked out of the fight by injury or death. In a war where the difference between life and death can be a matter of millimeters, these helmets proved to be more than just headgear. They became the difference between victory and defeat. As the dust settled and the battle was won, it was clear that the helmets had played a pivotal role in turning the tide. The soldiers who had once dismissed them as a frivolous innovation now saw the truth. They had underestimated the power of progress, of change, and of adaptation. In Gisbeto, the helmets weren't just a piece of military equipment. They were the unsung heroes, the silent protectors that allowed the soldiers to survive and ultimately win. In the chaos of war, it's easy to overlook the small innovations, the forgotten technologies that, while not flashy, ultimately shift the balance of power. While the focus is often on grand weapons and elaborate strategies, the true game changers are sometimes the things we don't expect: small, overlooked tools that redefine the way battles are fought. One such piece of forgotten technology would go on to alter the very nature of warfare, changing the way soldiers approached combat and making previous methods seem obsolete. This technology wasn't a weapon of mass destruction, nor was it a complicated, highly classified piece of machinery. In fact, it was so simple, it almost got lost in the rush of more dramatic innovations. It was a communications system, an unassuming device that connected soldiers on the ground to their commanders in ways that had never been done before. At the time, communication between troops and their leaders was limited to radios, field phones, and messengers, often slow, unreliable, and dizzily disrupted by the chaos of battle. The new communication system, however, was different. It allowed for real-time updates, sending critical information back and forth between soldiers in the field and their commanders without delay. It wasn't just about speed, it was about precision. It enabled commanders to give orders instantly, to adapt to changing circumstances, and to coordinate forces with unprecedented efficiency, while the generals had been relying on traditional, slower methods. This new technology offered them a direct line to the action, giving them the ability to make split-second decisions that were vital to the success of the operation. But what made this technology truly remarkable was its simplicity. It was a small, portable system that could be used by any soldier, not just the communications officers. It wasn't bogged down by complex procedures or maintenance requirements. It was designed to be intuitive, to fit seamlessly into the chaotic environment of the battlefield. And while its introduction was met with some skepticism, especially by those who were set in their old ways, the results spoke for themselves. In one particular battle, where communication had always been a bottleneck, this new system became the deciding factor. As the battle unfolded, commanders were able to issue real-time updates, adjusting strategies, and deploying reinforcements at a moment's notice. They could track the movement of enemy forces and coordinate attacks with precision that had been impossible before. The result? A stunning victory, despite the odds. What was once a slow and cumbersome process had been replaced by a technology that gave soldiers and commanders the edge they needed to succeed. This forgotten technology didn't just change one battle, it set a precedent for future conflicts, changing how wars would be fought from that point forward. It proved that sometimes the smallest, most overlooked innovations can have the most profound impact. And it all started with a simple idea that communication could be faster, clearer, and more reliable, even in the middle of chaos. In every war, there's always that one officer bold, unorthodox, and willing to go against the grain when it counts the most. While many adhere strictly to orders, following the chain of command to the letter, there are those who, when the situation demands it, will break the rules to achieve victory. One such commanding officer found himself in the midst of a critical battle, where the conventional strategies weren't working and the enemy seemed too powerful to defeat. Instead of sticking to the traditional methods that had led them to the brink of disaster, he made a bold decision that would change the course of the conflict. The battle had already been raging for days. The soldiers, weary and demoralized, had been pushed to their limits. The commanders, stuck in their old ways, refused to adapt to the rapidly changing nature of the enemy's tactics. It seemed like victory was slipping further away with each passing hour, and the soldiers felt as if they were marching to their doom. That's when their commanding officer, known for his unorthodox methods, took a step that no one had expected. Instead of waiting for reinforcements, instead of continuing with the plans that had already failed, he decided to go rogue. He ordered a surprise counteroffensive, something that broke every traditional rule of engagement. His plan was risky, but it was the only option left. While his fellow officers argued, clinging to outdated strategies, this officer made the choice to trust his gut and his soldiers, knowing that if they didn't take action now, they would lose everything. His decision was met with resistance, but he stood firm. The soldiers, though skeptical at first, rallied behind him, driven by a sense of hope that De Hadante felt in days. The plan was executed with precision. What had been a retreating army now began to push forward, catching the enemy by surprise. The enemy, used to facing predictable strategies, was unprepared for the boldness and unpredictability of the assault. The officer's decision to break away from the standard protocol, to take the risk when no one else would, turned the tide. As the battle raged on, the enemy forces began to falter, unable to cope with the new approach. Their lines broke, and victory was snatched from the jaws of defeat. This officer's rogue move didn't just lead to a tactical win, it became the turning point in the war. His decision to trust his instincts and lead his troops in an unexpected direction proved that sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to win. The soldiers who followed him were forever changed, not just by the victory they achieved, but by the trust they had in their commander. They learned that true leadership isn't about following orders, it's about knowing when to step outside the box, to make the tough decisions when no one else will. In the chaos of war, it's often the unsung heroes, the ones whose names we never hear, that make the most significant impact. They don't seek recognition, don't expect accolades. They simply do what needs to be done, often at great personal risk, in order to ensure the survival of those around them. This story is about one such hero, an individual whose one act of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds saved thousands of lives and changed the course of history in ways no one could have predicted. This hero wasn't a soldier with a gun or a general with a brilliant battle plan. No, this hero was someone far less likely to be in the spotlight. A low-ranking officer tasked with ensuring the safe evacuation of a vulnerable position. The odds were stacked against him, and he knew it. The enemy was closing in, and every conventional tactic had failed. The heroes were prepared to abandon the mission, to give up and leave the soldiers to their fate. But this officer, against all odds, refused to follow the order. He believed that there was still a chance, that there was still a way to turn the situation around. So he did the unthinkable. He went against the direct orders of his commanding officers and decided to stay behind, ensuring that every soldier under his command was evacuated safely. He knew that his decision could cost him everything: his career, his reputation, even his life. But in that moment, the only thing that mattered was the survival of his men. He devised a plan, using every scrap of available resources and every ounce of his tactical knowledge, to create an escape route that would allow his soldiers to safely retreat while he bought them precious time. It wasn't a perfect plan, it was risky, and it was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had left. The officer's defiance worked. Against all expectations, the soldiers managed to escape, with the enemy none the wiser. His actions not only saved countless lives, but also allowed the larger army to regroup and strike back later, ultimately securing a victory that would have otherwise been impossible. His decision to defy the orders and act on his own initiative became the turning point that prevented a disaster from becoming a full-scale defeat. But, as with many unsung heroes, his story was largely forgotten in the grand sweep of history. He didn't receive any medals or formal recognition. His name wasn't immortalized in any war memorial, but those who were there, those who survived because of his bravery, never forgot what he did for them. His act of defiance, a moment of sheer determination in the face of overwhelming odds, changed the fate of thousands. And in the end, that's what true heroism is all about. Not the medals or the recognition, but the quiet, courageous decisions that are made in the most difficult of circumstances, when no one is watching and the stakes couldn't be higher. If you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with us through these incredible stories. It's people like the unsung heroes we've discussed today who truly change the course of history through courage, defiance, and unrelenting determination. If you feel inspired by these untold stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll join us in uncovering more hidden moments from history that are often overlooked but should never be forgotten. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell us, what did you think about these unsung heroes? Who do you think deserves to be remembered more for their courageous actions? Let us know your thoughts. And don't forget to give us a thumbs up if you found this video valuable. You're ready for more history and hidden stories? Make sure to watch the next video that's popping up on your screen. Trust us, you won't want to miss it.